This TA is going to cover the background for the Jan-Feb 2019-2020 topic, resolved states ought to eliminate their nuclear arsenals. It's mostly designed as an extremely introductory grounding in what we expect the topicality debates to look like and the history of nuclear arsenals, as well as the status quo of nuclear arsenals right now, to help you better understand all of the rest of the TAs that you're about to watch and the positions that coaches are about to recommend. So let's get started. First, let's start with some topicality. I think the three biggest words in this resolution that we have to make sure that we're on top of from a topicality perspective is the word states, the words eliminate, and the words nuclear arsenals. So let's go through each of them one at a time. Let's start with T states. The obvious place that this debate will represent itself in terms of topicality is the bare versus existential plural debate. This has basically been a consistent running trend now in years worth of LD resolution. So you'll see affirmatives defend a specific state, right, and such as India or Pakistan or China or the US or Russia or blah, 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 insert country here. And you'll see the negative argue that the affirmative should have defended all states. Additionally, you'll see a singular versus a plural debate here. So states means more than one. This debate is very interesting. I think that the more than one perspective requires, the affirmative to defend two states eliminating their nuclear arsenals. But the question becomes, is that actually more predictable? Because presumably the affirmative could choose any two countries in tandem. However, the obvious two countries that you would see in this resolution would be a pair of countries that are obviously antagonistic to each other, such as India and Pakistan. So I think an AF plan text that was like both India and Pakistan will eliminate their nuclear arsenals would obviously meet T plural on states, and that would potentially be viable both from a predictability and grounded basis in the literature and from obviously a grammar perspective. I think the last thing to keep in mind here is that in previous LD resolutions where we've used the word states to signify, international governments, sometimes people tend to want to do some silliness with the definition of states and they'll defend the state as like the Republic of California and things like that. I think that it makes it a little bit more difficult in this resolution to do that because presumably individual states in the US, for instance, don't have an actual nuclear arsenal. The nuclear arsenal is not owned, for instance, by California or Nevada or Mississippi. It's owned broadly by the United States. And so obviously colloquially the word states here refers to international regimes and governments, but I think that, you should expect the possibility that some people will abuse the word states as representing individual states in the US. Next, let's look at T eliminate. So the obvious place to start is the distinction between a reduction and an elimination. Colloquially, if we think about eliminating something, we get rid of it. If we reduce something, we have less of it. Right? So eliminating a nuclear arsenal means that you eliminate whatever portion of a nuclear arsenal that the affirmative defense decides to defend. Now, the next question is like, what is the process by which this happens? Does this get phased out in terms of it being the nuclear arsenal for any given state, or is it immediate disarmament? That is obviously a debate that both sides will have frequently, and it is a debate that lends itself to really interesting process questions for us to explore for what elimination entails and how we should go about the process of elimination. The other interesting process question here is who would monitor the elimination? Is it some international body? Is it the UN, et cetera, et cetera? Because I think there are interesting DAs that come up as a result of whoever is in charge of monitoring. And it's also an interesting question of whether the affirmative should have to defend a specific monitoring body or a specific elimination process. So the equivalent of process spec on this resolution will be like you have to defend a process by which we eliminate and disarm. Right? And the disarmament process is fascinating because obviously nuclear waste is a huge portion of how we think about whether or not, we should get rid of nuclear weapons. Where would those nuclear weapons go? Do we launch them into space? Do we bury them in the ocean? Do we just put them far underground? We have to think about things like nuclear contamination, et cetera, et cetera. And so the T eliminate debate will be interesting. Next, let's look at nuclear arsenals. So nuclear arsenal is a term of art. It obviously entails a bunch of things. It doesn't just entail nuclear weapons, which might be the first thing you think of. It also entails all of the equipment necessary to create nuclear weapons. It also entails all of the equipment necessary to launch nuclear weapons. So think like launch pads, think like super enriched uranium, all the technology, both hardware and software you need to create all of that plutonium, et cetera, et cetera. I think the key word here is the word arsenal. According to just like a basic Google search, arsenal is the collection of weapons and military equipment stored by a country, person, or group. And so the other definition is an array of resources available for a certain purpose. As you can see, these are quite broad definitions, which creates a really interesting question about what the scope of the affirmative should include. If the affirmative defends getting rid of everything, then presumably there's really interesting counterclaim ground for the negative that says, hey, look, like let's get rid of everything but this one specific form of the nuclear arsenal, be it for energy purposes, or be it for security purposes, or be it for future rearmament purposes, right? And I think that that's an example of a small plan-inclusive counterclaim that makes it really hard for the 1AR to restart and generate offense against the affirmative on, or against the negative on. So we have to think through what we defend in terms of arsenals and what we're getting rid of. Additionally, obviously, the same existential versus bare plural debate applies here to T nuclear arsenals, which is specifically that, does the affirmative have to defend getting rid of every part of the nuclear arsenal, or can the affirmative choose a specific part of the nuclear arsenal? And so, you can get multiple forms of spec here now. You can get spec in terms of the countries that the affirmative defends, and you can get spec in terms of the amount of the nuclear arsenal that they defend, that they're eliminating. Right? And so they could eliminate only, for instance, tactical nuclear weapons, or they could eliminate only, for instance, all of their current enriched plutonium supplies, et cetera, et cetera. So now let's delve into moving away from topicality, what's going on in the status quo. I think that this chart is pretty informative from the Arms Control Association. As you can see, there are roughly about 8 countries that have nuclear warheads. You can see that Russia and the United States have significantly more than everyone else. And you can see that there are some neighboring countries which historically haven't been the biggest fans of each other who have nuclear weapons as well. I think the most obvious example of 2 countries who have had historical tensions is Pakistan and India. So I think that what's interesting about this chart is that almost 90% of the nukes belong to Russia and the U.S. And we are going to talk about, the reality that not all nukes are active, that not all nukes are ready to be used, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think that'll be covered in other TAs. But, it's not like there's a trivial amount of nuclear warheads in the status quo. There's a lot of nukes out there. Cool. I think the second thing I want to chat about in terms of the status quo is I think it's really interesting to look at how the inventory of nuclear warheads has evolved over time. So you can see starting in the mid-1940s when the U.S. first developed the bomb, and we used it in Japan, obviously, to end World War II, there has been basically a steady and rapid incline, almost exponentially in terms of the maths of it, of the global warhead inventory, right? And the way we think about warhead inventory is it's the amount of stockpiled that are active and ready to use as well as the amount of retired. And it peaked, you can see, roughly around the late 1980s, right? So you can see like huge increase during the Cold War era, which was in the 70s and the 80s, and you can see that right around here in the late 1980s as modern-day Soviet Union collapsed and we got Russia, you can see the Russian stockpile peaked right around the time that the Soviet Union collapsed. And then from there, it's been steady decline, pretty exponentially, actually. The Russians have gone from roughly 40K down to below 10K in 30 years, which is a pretty radical decrease. And the U.S. has gone from roughly 20-some thousand down to ditto, like less than 10K in 20 years as well. So there's been a steady decrease. And you can get a clear sense of all the other countries, though they have nukes, are obviously not major players in terms of net volume of nuclear weapons. Okay, The next thing I think worth chatting about are relevant international treaties. So there are a few relevant international treaties, and I will put this slideshow available to everyone on the team via Slack. So I really, really encourage you to check these links because I don't want to just summarize these links for you. I think there's a lot of valuable data here that you should just quickly read through. It'll take you about 5-10 minutes, and it'll really help ground your understanding of these treaties better. But I'll take you through some of the most important parts. So the first thing is understanding treaties are non-binding and non-enforceable. Unlike laws in a domestic area, such as in California or even in the United States, there's actually a governing body that can enforce laws, right? So in the US, for instance, if you commit a homicide, then you will, and you get caught, obviously you'll be tried by law enforcement, right? And the type of law enforcement that tries you is dependent on the nature of the crime that you committed and where you committed the crime, right? So if you committed the crime in international waters or in another country, you'll be extradited and you'll be you'll be tried federally, right? If you committed the crimes, presumably in California, it's more likely you'll be tried within the jurisdiction of California, et cetera, et cetera. However, when you start thinking about it at the international level, who is the governing body that tries international countries, right? This is sort of the classic anarchical dilemma that we face when we're contemplating what does it mean philosophically and from an implementation perspective for international bodies to coexist. The UN, frankly, doesn't have a lot of governing power, right? It's something that countries voluntarily opt into and they can choose to opt out of. Now, obviously, countries can form allyships amongst each other and create a situation where they pressure another country to comply with an international agreement, but ultimately there's no hard mechanism to force a compliance, right? So all of these treaties, you can think of them, frankly, as like really well-written suggestions that most countries have opted into, right? Now, each of these treaties, however, have their own unique downsides. Like the NPT, for instance, is the treaty that the most amount of countries have opted into. It started to really gain power and influence, I think, in the late 80s, but there's a few separate countries that literally have nuclear weapons that have not signed the Treaty of Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons. So what does it mean for us to have a treaty that 75-80% of the international arena opts into, but 25% of the international arena says no thanks, and that 25% is some of the countries that literally have nukes? I think this is important both for our beginner students and our high-level students because when you're hitting disads based on violation of treaties, right, I think that pressing them on the impact level of this scenario is really useful, especially analytically, because it seems like we violate treaties all the time and the repercussions are minimal at best. And it seems like the status quo has pretty severe violations of treaties. And so I think that's a good place to press and to think about what does it mean for us to violate a treaty? Ditto with the Treaty of Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. This is the most recent treaty that gained traction, I think, in the 2010s. However, what's notable is that the United States isn't part of this treaty, right? And if we own roughly a little under 50% of the world's stockpile of nuclear weapons, and we've politely been like, no thanks, what does it mean for us for this treaty to be in play, and what does it mean for it to be enforced? Probably not a whole lot, frankly. And I think the last one that's interesting that is one of the major treaties on, the nuclear arsenal literature, be that owning nuclear arsenals, testing nuclear arsenals, etc., is the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. So unfortunately, nuclear testing has a really nasty history where essentially we've tested nuclear weapons in, what people consider to be fourth world countries, like small indigenous islands in off the coast of the Americas, things like really rural areas in the desert in the Americas, et cetera, et cetera. And, it's resulted in basically creating massive amounts of land that are just uninhabitable and due to nuclear radiation. And so I think it's important to note that we do have a comprehensive nuclear test ban treaty, but, as you'll start noticing when you start listening to the other TAs, this test ban treaty is merely a suggestion, right? I think North Korea in the last few years has definitely tested the nuke. And I'm pretty positive the United States and Russia
do covert tests either underground or over the ocean to see if it's working, it being their newest nuclear weapons. And so, yeah, I think please click on these links, explore them more. It'll take you clearly through who's part of them, who's not part of them, etc. And that'll give you a clear grounding of the major treaties that exist in the status quo that help govern our collective understanding of how we're supposed to own and operate in a world that is nuclear. Okay, I think the next thing worth talking about is building a nuclear weapon. Now, this process is deeply simplified, and I think that it's not really that important that you have like a really, really concrete understanding of what needs to be going into building a nuclear weapon. But I think that this chart and the text below are a really, really good summary of what it takes to build a nuclear weapon. The biggest thing I want to stress to you here is that this process is not easy. This process is extremely complicated, and in our experience historically, debaters tend to oversimplify the process of what it takes for a rogue nation or group or terrorist organization, blah, 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 to make a nuclear weapon. It is extremely complex. It requires a ton of technology. It requires a ton of expertise from a scientific level. It requires a obviously safe house to store all of this. And then you have to deal with the fact that, other countries are on watch. So it's not like it's very easy to just like secretly build a massive lab and then make like 90 to 110 pounds of HEU, which is, highly enriched uranium. And so I think that it's important to understand just how difficult this process is. In terms of the literal mechanics of it, I'm not the best person to explain it, unfortunately, because I'm not a nuclear scientist. But I think that this design and this chart right here should hopefully give you enough of an overview. Basically, uranium is a naturally occurring compound in the world, and it needs to get enriched. And the enrichment process is time-intensive, money-intensive, and just requires a lot of technical expertise. And so I'll leave it here. If you guys want more information on how a nuclear weapon gets built, please DM me on Slack, and I can point you to the resources that I found to be informative on this. So let's talk next about the process of nuclear war. I want to start with the reason people think nuclear war is so bad. Well, I think the obvious reason is that a nuclear bomb can kill hundreds of thousands of people, and if it resulted in escalation, where a lot of people launched nuclear weapons, people being countries in this instance, it arguably could cause mass devastation, both in terms of literal humans' lives lost and in terms of biodiversity effects. It would significantly alter the terrain, the climate, the ability for plants to grow, the ability for animals and livestock to grow, and that would significantly affect how livable different portions of the earth are. And obviously, tons of people would die along the process. So obviously, a nuclear war is extremely scary, and people, really. It was considered the preeminent threat in the later half of the 20th century. Now I think most scholars think the preeminent threat is global warming, not nuclear war. But there's a difference between an isolated singular nuclear attack and then an all-out nuclear war. The more all-out the nuclear war it gets, the more Armageddon type status we get to, the more and more scared I think collectively we should be about whether or not the extinction scenario that debaters love to talk about is actually accurate. I think the probability claim rises exponentially the more and more nukes that are launched. So there are two general types of nuclear weapons. There are strategic nuclear weapons and there are tactical nuclear weapons. And this is also an obvious way we can specify, like, let's just get rid of all strategic nuclear weapons, but let's keep tactical weapons, right? Strategic nuclear weapons, as you can imagine, are used and created for the purposes of attacking countries. Tactical nuclear weapons are created and used for the purposes of defending yourself and creating a credible second strike capability. So, second strike versus first strike is important to understand here, because if a country knows that they can attack you and credibly destroy your ability to respond, then the amount that they are deterred from doing so is purely a function of how much they think they'll piss off your allies, not how much they'll piss you off. This is important because if I basically know I can attack you and you won't be able to do anything, it's just your friends who will be able to do anything, then my hesitation to attack you goes way down. This is why countries have invested significantly in both building allyships and building capabilities of attack that allow them to survive a first strike attack. And so traditionally, what we refer to this as the nuclear triad, where you have traditionally strategic nuclear weapons. You have ICBMs, which are what we call intercontinental ballistic missiles. Basically, think about like nukes that we can launch across the world really fast. They can reach its target in like below 10 minutes with a high degree of accuracy. And then we have submarine launched ballistic missiles, SLBMs, which, as you can imagine, are launched underwater and make them much harder to predict and defend against. So having a three-branch nuclear capability is important because it means we can attack by land, by air, and by water, right? The air is the ICBMs, the water is the SLBMs, and by land is the traditional strategic bombers. And so it reduces significantly the possibility that some enemy state could destroy all of a country's nuclear forces. So I know for a fact, obviously, Russia and the US have all three. I think India has the nuclear triad as a functional triad. I know China does as well, and I know the UK and France do as well. So we have enough countries already that haven't, that enough players in the game that have all three abilities to respond in kind, and there are enough allyships that we are extremely interconnected in the concept of what would happen for the logistics of a nuclear war to occur. So I know that a lot of people will read nuke war scenarios. Remember, these scenarios need to be grounded in the reality that countries are allies with one another, and countries have mutually built incentives that are aligned to prevent their allies from being destroyed. And these incentives are things like trade agreements, economic agreements, cultural agreements. Countries have like members of their own citizenry living in other countries, et cetera, et cetera. And so it's not like I think all countries would just stand by pat if country A attacked country B and just completely destroyed it, right? I think there would be serious repercussions. And so I want you to just remember that nuclear war, while it is an obviously huge impact, it needs to be grounded in the reality that there are a lot of incentive structures in place for us to avoid that impact. So, in conclusion, this has been a super top level, easy introduction to the background of the topic. Understanding the basic background of what are nuclear weapons, what will the T debates here look like, what does the process of elimination look like, what is the reality of how nuclear war occurs, why is nuclear war so bad, will help you ground your research and your positions, and will help you understand the TAs you're about to watch in terms of specific positions on the AF and specific positions on the neg. This topic in particular will have a lot of really interesting critical and LARP-based positions available, so it'll lend itself to deep research, and lots of practice will be necessary ongoing for an answering common impact defense in turns. I'm personally really excited. This is the TFC topic. I know we have a lot of seniors who've worked really hard over the years to prepare for this, and I'm thrilled that they got a topic that will lend itself to deep research and innovative, creative case writing. Don't hesitate at all to DM me if you have questions about this introduction to the TA. To the topic, and happy hunting. I'm wishing you all the best of luck.